themselves. But before we go into each individual stage, I asked the question, how do you respond to overwhelming emotions? And you can kind of see where people are at, on their journey. Some people saying when they experience overwhelming emotions, they withdraw, or, someone else seeing here, how do you respond? Badly, let time pass and the emotions ease. Sometimes it takes days or even weeks to settle. Some people saying they laugh or they cry, depending on what's there, which I think is, nothing wrong with that. And then someone else saying that they have a cold water bath or a cold shower or something, which is interesting. Not sure how accessible that is, all the time, but I kind of get that. I do that every morning. And then people kind of moving to the other end of the scale, saying all emotions need to be accepted, embraced, and finally loved. A lot of people saying meditation or gratitude, feel them, movement. So, there's a lot of different contrasting answers to the way to deal with overwhelming emotions. It kind of gives an idea of where people are at on this journey, I always think. And the individual stages, we all start off at the same place, really, I think, which is the first stage, which is life is happening to me. And this is very much a victim mentality. And so when overwhelming situations happen, when traumatic situations happen in life, it's very much a case of the ego coming online. Why is this happening to me? Very much complaining and playing the victim and being a victim of external circumstances, not seeing the kind of the evolution that can take place through difficult situations. And I think often this is where we start. And by the way, all the work that I've done over the last 10 or 12 years, I still find myself slipping into that. I was out in the Brecon Beacons on the weekend and I got caught in a pretty bad storm. And my mind was doing exactly that. What am I doing here? I'm an idiot. What have I done? Why does this always happen to me? But I was able to kind of listen to those thoughts come up and not get sucked into them and kind of, move on to these other stages that we'll talk about. But first of all, welcome, Stephen. Great to have you back, mate.
Thank you.
That first stage, life happens to me. Can you kind of relate to that one on your own journey in terms of where you've been on your?
Yeah, I think for me it's and maybe helpful to share with people. What are we doing this work for? Is the first thing that came into my mind, and my perspective from what I've learned and what I'm practicing every day, because to me this becomes a lifestyle, it becomes part of what you are, is to connect back to the self. And we don't realize in that first stages that there is a self most of the time.
Yeah.
And we don't recognize that there's anything wrong. When I mean wrong, it's probably the wrong word. We don't realize there's wounding and trauma that's stopping us from connecting to the self. So in other words, we've disconnected.
Yeah.
It could have been we've been distorted along the way or whatever it is, but certainly for me, as we're on a call last night discussing the rigid pattern, and that was where I came from. But interestingly enough, it created a merger in me as well. So to put that into perspective for people, and I love also, by the way, before we go into that, is all the different people's perspective to that question. And again, to me, in my experience, we're all here to experience different things. And that's why we have different perspectives. And that's why different things trigger and open up for us along the way, because it's a different journey. It's like a fingerprint. So rigid pattern is basically never got love from parents. It was just an expectation of showing up in a certain way. Be that good at sports, be that good at arithmetic. And I thought about it after the call, and I remember, because when we were in the call, funnily enough, I was feeling in for the very first time to that small child that was going through all that. And I'd never done that before, because I'd never sat in that experience before. and I was actually feeling sadness for that boy, but at the same time joy, because he's not in that space anymore. He's released all that trauma that was coming to the surface. I'm not saying there isn't more, I'm just saying there's a lot being released. So for me, two things was happening. I was expected to, and what I remembered was today, this morning, two things. Number one was that I remember my father going through the times table with me before I'd actually gone to school. He was making sure that I arrived at school and I could do my times table. And I remember every night before we went to bed, he would ram it down my throat. Did it do any good? No. Because schooling to me, well, I say no. When my parents were still together at that stage, when I went to the, whatever you call infant school, or the first stages of proper school. And then my parents split up when I was a year or two into that. And that was when I lost interest in everything. I wasn't interested in what was going around me, whether that was trauma or whatever was going on. I did not want to know. So of course, you're a fool, you're an idiot, pay attention, stop wasting your life, you don't pay attention, you could do better. Always reports was, doesn't pay attention, could do better. And that was schooling. So schooling was compounding. And when we look back at it, and you understand all this stuff, and it's mainly due to a release somewhere along the way, you suddenly realize how homogenized we are as children, pushed into a system, pushed into a conditioning. My parents, by the way, didn't know any better, because one was abandoned very much, but she narcissistic tendencies as her coping mechanism, and the other one, his father was pretty awful to him, but that was probably because his father was pretty awful to him. So it did get better. My father wasn't awful to me per se. He would clout me, because in those days it was like give you a thick ear if you stepped out of line, because it was like break the child. That was and even I think Freud was very much, or one of them was pushing to break the child at that time. I forget which psychotherapist it was or psychiatric it was. I don't know, but there was something about breaking the child in those days. So I went through that, and yes, did I actually think, why is this always happening to me? Yes, I did. Probably more in childhood than teenage years, because what I'd learned to do as a coping mechanism was stuff everybody else. I'm going to look after myself. And if I felt there was going to be any hurt, I would shut this brick wall up and make sure nobody got near me. I learned to be very charming when I wanted to be. That's why I ended up in sales. I could really talk, I could really deliver. I had an adaptability of talking to people, even as a young man, sort of in my early 20s when I got into sales. And that was the old sales with a briefcase and a car and samples going around factories. So when I was in with business owners, I had an adaptability to talking to people at whatever level. And it was all down to this core wounding. So that was my wounding. And without realizing it, I didn't feel good enough to show up, even though I could, because that was a mask. I was always questioning myself, and I always wanted, and this is quite interesting, I was desperate to get into business because there was a very lack of money in my childhood. My mother managed to marry into money because that was her narcissistic tendencies to make sure that's how she survived. Very attractive woman, so she could use that attribute to attract wealthy people, and that's what she did. So at one stage she settled down, and it was quite affluent, but I needed that affluence, and I was at an age where I knew that they weren't going to give it to me. I had to go out and get it. So of course that driven again, achieving, and that was a bit like the aggressive pattern coming in, where it's I've got to achieve, I'm going to make it, rah rah rah. And that was when I got into personal development, and that was the next stage. I was working as a sales rep, pretty good at it. I was being headhunted from time to time and offered more money and a better car and the usual stuff. But at the same time, I was side hustling, trying to build a multi-level marketing business. With that business came personal development. And I lived, ate, and breathed personal development. In the old days, there were cassette tapes in the car, so I used to put them on and I would eat this stuff. And my parent that I was with, mainly with my mother, because when we split up, I went with my mother. I saw my father irregularly, really. And she used to say, oh, you're being brainwashed, typical American stuff. So she would even put that down because, of course, her coping mechanism was a whole fear of me earning or achieving more than she had.
Right.
So narcissist, you see. So quite interesting that was. So along that path I went, got into personal development. And of course, the personal development part of it was, it's not happening. Don't think negative, think positive.
Yes.
That's not happening, think
bypassing.
Can you remember? So,
bypass, yeah.
Yeah, those days were, and it was like Zig Ziglar, see you at the top, was very much run. If you come to a fork in the road and you're not sure which way to go, run down one as fast as you can, because you'll find out quicker whether it's the right road or the wrong road. You always come back, run down the other road. So you were constantly not really knowing where you were going.
Yes.
And pump the pump as well was another one of his sayings. So the old stand pump, you used to see in the westerns on the TV, you'd keep pumping the handle, and he'd use that as an analogy. And most people would stop and run out of energy, and they'd just got the water from hundreds of feet down. They'd just got the water to come out, didn't realize it, and they'd stop. So in other words, don't quit.
Classic mindset. Yeah.
Keep going. So what you do is you keep going and keep going down the wrong flaming road. Conditioning is don't quit. Stop quitting. Yeah. You're a quitter.
Yeah.
If you pack that up, you're a quitter. So I moved from the conditioning of narcissism and being driven into conditioning of personal development of don't quit, keep going, this is how it is, and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Burn the boats.
Hey, and I'm not knocking all that. That was my experience and my journey that I needed to experience, and I needed to journey. And I do see people now, and I've managed to sort of unhook from the ego, which will come in a minute. I do not get involved. It's their journey. If they ask me advice, then I will give a view. But if I see people what I would deem as the path I was following, I keep quiet. Yeah. Unless they're a client or unless I get asked. Because a lot of the time we're here to experience certain things.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's not for me to interfere in people's journeys. So that was the next stage. But something began to awaken into me that what that personal development did was there is something more out there. It began to create this, I could see this hole. I was still very rigid and very driven that I was going to get into business, which I did eventually. But there was this gap, there was something missing. And when I was getting into business, because the rigid pattern, the way I showed up, and I was told, because I didn't want to do this work and be an achiever, I was put down for that. I then had no confidence. I merged into other people. So I wanted to set up into business. So I was looking for a business partner all the time. And of course, back in those days, all the advice was never have a partner, do it on your own. I had a fear of doing it on my own because of that conditioning. But so I was merging, looking for people to get into business with. And multi-level marketing was okay because you were in with a group of people. And then eventually I went through and I ended up in partnership in a business with, guess who? A guy that was a narcissist. So I went from a mother to him, and all that I'd learned all through that personal development, he destroyed it. He actually stood on me without me realizing. He was very subtle. He was very clever. Yeah, I didn't. My wife did. She kept trying to point to it, that she didn't like him and that he was manipulating, etc. It was absolutely right, as my wife normally is. But back in those days, I didn't listen because I knew best. That I was still attached to this ego that was driving. Anyway, the light came, and the next phase was the ego was taking over, and right, you don't need anybody, off you go. So we bought a business basically, and that was the biggest frightening thing I ever did, because we put everything on the line. We put the house, we put everything on the line, and bought this business in a trade that I'd never even been in. But to me, buying and selling, producing something with ingredients or raw material and selling it to a retail outlet or a wholesale outlet was more or less the same as what I'd been doing for 20 odd years. So, but once I jumped in there, boy, did I really get frightened. The ego began to let go a little bit then at that stage. And I began to connect. I look back now, and as we're talking, I began to connect a little bit with self. But it was
when we say self, Stephen, I mean, I just want to. It's a tricky one to explain, right, isn't it? But we have this. What you can say is that when up until that point, you'd been identifying with a false sense of self. I'm sure anyone listening to this can kind of understand what is the real self, but
not a false sense of self. I was not connected with. This is my perception. The self is the soul, or is your energy, whatever you want to call it, and it's all surrounded with your awareness and everything else. It's all connected in, and we're all connected, whether we accept it or not. We are. But with all this conditioning, we disconnect from that.
Yeah,
everything becomes distorted. The ego distorts everything. The mind distorts everything. Tells us stories. You go to bed at night. You wake up early hours of the morning in fear, especially if you're in business, and that was mine, in fear that I wasn't doing enough. I had to put longer hours in. We had to make more and more money, even though we were doing okay. And all this was going on. And so this, what I call the ego, was controlling everything. And I was not anywhere near connected to the self that hangs around in here somewhere.
You're disconnected in that sense from your true power, aren't you? I mean,
yes,
as I say, when you're kind of identified with a part, or which is essentially trauma, then
yes,
you're essentially at the whim of the outside world, aren't you? Like you say, it's like,
yes,
I'm powerless. Everything's happening to me. You know, a lot of people you hear like blaming, political parties or the elites,
yes,
or even like your ex or whatever it is. It's like it's their fault. My life is like this because of someone else. You're not owning your true power. You don't know your true power to shape your own reality at that point.
Yeah, and that's a good point. What I missed, I'm glad you brought that in, and appreciate that, because of the personal development I did in the early days. Of course, I was conditioned not to blame anything else except me.
Right.
So because I was so heavy into it from a young age of like 21, I was really going into it. I was taught and conditioned, everything's your responsibility, but this is how you get away with it. And what you do is you tune in the ego into driving everything forward. Anything that comes up that, if you like, call the self, the awareness, the emotion, whatever, is all, to me, all tied up in there, it would push away. So the ego would like, no, this is where we're going, think positive. And it was amazing, because when a fear, now you've talked about that, when a fear used to come up, it would be those words. This was personal development again. Action conquers fear. It doesn't matter. And I used to, this ego here was so strong. If I had to make a phone call to a very awkward buyer or somebody I needed to sell to, that fear would come up and it'd be action conquers fear. And I'd be, right. Yes. And I remember fearfully picking the phone up and dialing the number. But you know what? It was absolutely right. Because when you'd finished the call or you'd done what you were fearful of, you'd think, what was that all about? Why was I worried again? But what we don't notice is it comes up again, and it comes up again, and it comes up again, because
resolved it. Yeah,
we haven't healed it, we haven't let go of it. So when I'm saying we glimpse in the self, I began to glimpse emotion slightly. I began to, because I got married first time at 21, and we were out of that marriage at 23, and that's whereabouts I was beginning to. I had some emotion around that, and I'm like, wow, but only a glimpse, because then I managed to shut this off. So I had a glimpse. So, and then the multi-level marketing took me down various rabbit holes, and it got me to look for this gap that was there. I went into business with this guy. I'd left all the multi-level marketing behind, and because I was a shareholder, I put all my efforts into this business, and we were about 10 years in before I managed to get out. I wanted out at 7 years, but it took me 3 years to get out, and then we eventually bought a business, and away we went. And the glimpsing became a bit more, because it was I was more tuning into my wife at that time, who was very intuitive. And guess what? I didn't know how intuitive and how switched on she was until a couple of years ago, when I started doing different types of work, and I'm like amazed at what gifts she'd got. So that's how closed off this was. So as I pursued the business, everything was going fine, and then what took over was the ego again, and it was driving me so hard. I was working ridiculous hours. I would be waking up at 4:30 in the morning, and I would just get up and go to work, and I'd stay there till 6 at night, and I'd come home exhausted, fall asleep, and the same thing would happen. Weekends, I would go and do my own thing on a Saturday. My wife would take my son off to football. I didn't do football. It wasn't my thing. So you go and take him. That's how the ego was showing up. And we got a couple of daughters as well. So she was doing, I used to do runarounds at night, but Saturdays were my thing, and I would do my sport on a Saturday, and that's how it worked. And then it all came to a head, where I got slapped on the back of the head, and that was when I really let go of the ego. And funnily enough, I mentioned it last night, a few years before that, a psychotherapist round the corner who had just sort of diagnosed our son with what she thought was Asperger's syndrome, and it turned out it was ADHD with some other labels they gave him as well. But he was struggling with life, and of course we didn't understand what he was struggling with. Was connecting. He was connected to himself, but he was different, and he didn't know how to connect. Well, to us, he was different, because we didn't know how to connect to him on his level. So he went down a road, and he's on his own experiences at that time, and still is. But we're very much connected with him now, and we're very much trying to guide him as much as we can into the path of enlightenment. And somebody said to me, this psychotherapist, she mentioned in passing, oh, and of course, I can't remember how it was, but I mentioned it last night, but it's, oh, of course, and your trauma that you experienced as a child. And this really reared up at that point. Trauma. And I will not repeat exactly what it was saying, but there was a lot of expletives in there, what you're talking about. But I didn't actually say anything. But I look back now, of course, and as I've come through, and so what I'm pointing to is when we're going through life to connect back to this, we end up doing this type of work, and personal development is a type of work.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely certain if I hadn't had experienced the personal development, would I have ended up where I am now? I've no idea. But that was a small catalyst along the way of experiences. And for me, with my wounding, ego was running, and it was all those, and I'd get fears coming in and what you were talking about, an overwhelm. But because of the conditioning I'd had, I managed to push them down, and I would feel them hugely. And I remember when I was in business, I'd have to talk to a member of staff over something. Maybe he was a bit disgruntled and wanted more money or something like that. And I remember I'd have a fear of him leaving. It didn't matter who it was, part of the team, small company business, 20 people. Somebody leaves, it causes disruption. So there would be the fear of them leaving, but I knew I would have to have a chat with them. And inside, I was like really churning, fear churning. But you wouldn't have not known. The only thing you would have known of, which I didn't realize at the time, is I used to come across really aggressive. I would come across on the attack because the unconscious mind was attacking. Again, personal development, you attack before anybody else can come to you.
Protection mechanism.
Yeah, it's a form of defense. So, and so inevitably, they never went out the door settled. And I got a good team of people. And and my wife would pick me up on this. This was on the early days. And I would get angry with her for pointing out to me, how dare she, that I run this company, you only come to work 2 afternoons a week, you do accounts, I do this, I deal with staff. And I remember all this coming out. And it's really fascinating when you look back now. But what happened was her words would penetrate and her words would land. So that was a new awareness. So all the time the ego was running, there was times and moments of experiences that would glimpse into what goes on in here, the true self, the glimpse of that, and the awareness would begin to start to, it's a bit like it would start to glow, a dim light maybe, and pulsate if you want. That's what comes in actually. While I can visualize like a small glowing dim light down a deep tunnel that's starting to just come, and it comes up the top. And the more work you do, and the more you want to connect and invite it in, it comes up the tunnel and it gets brighter and brighter. So
well, let's stop there because we're going to move on to like third stage there. I think I just want to cover that because what's really interesting about that is you're kind of explaining beautifully the kind of journey from stage 1 to stage 2. Stage 1 is very much, we call it life is happening to me, but essentially you're lost and you're locked into your trauma and your conditioning, which is the ego. And Stephen there is mentioning several personality patterns, the rigid pattern, the aggressive pattern. For anyone who doesn't know anything about that, 5 personality patterns, Stephen Kessler is a great book about that. You can read into these different personality patterns. We all run all the patterns, but some greater than others. Like my probably major pattern was a lever pattern. But I can certainly relate to the rigid pattern and the aggressive pattern. Basically what these are these ways of defending ourselves when we're too young to process energy. And so we have these ways of basically moving that energy on. The aggressive pattern pushes it outwards. The rigid pattern, it kind of all goes up to the head, like Stephen's talking about. It's very much about performance. Doing. Lever pattern is very much, very much up and away. The energy is going away. But there's other patterns in it, which is very interesting. you know, depending on where you are on your journey, to learn about the personality patterns. But of course, you know, who we truly are, Stephen talked about, the true self, has very little to do with these patterns, because that is the part that binds us all together, which is, you could call it awareness, the witness, soul, or spirit, whatever you want to call it. And so I think it sounds to me like that's what's kind of coming online at this point. And so that second, we all enter, we all come into this life and this society, and at some point we kind of lose ourselves completely. The way I think of it, though, is almost like we signed up for it, and it is meant to be that way. We're almost meant to lose ourselves, and then the journey is, can we find ourselves again? You know, it's like a game of hide and seek, isn't it? You obviously come into this world and we know who we are, but we can't articulate it. But at some point, for a series of trauma and conditioning that's kind of laid down by society, I mean, think about it. I mean, certainly me growing up, no one was talking about spirituality. No one was talking about the true self or awareness. Like, you found it, obviously, a path through personal development, which is kind of a very masculine world, isn't it? As you said, it's about overcoming and doing and achieving more through personal development. But the world about the thing about that world, personal development and mindset, it kind of, I think it does a good job of getting to that second stage, which is life is happening for me. So it's kind of like, I've heard awakening described in the past by various people as a series of softenings. It's almost like going from head and you're making the journey down to the heart. Just slowly, the heart, like you said, the heart starts to come online. And there's a realization that, I don't have to, burn myself into the ground. I don't have to work all the hours that God sends. I don't have to compete with everyone. I don't have to kind of achieve, and so it's a series of softenings into the feminine, you could say, and a realization. That's what mindset, I think, is very good at, is this realization that, I'm not a victim, and I do actually have some control over my reality. Whereas in the past, it's like you're giving away all your power. It's this politician's fault. It's this political party's fault. It's my ex's fault that my life is like this, blaming others. This second stage is very much about, taking responsibility, not blame necessarily, not blaming yourself for your reality, but just knowing that, I am the creator of my reality. My external reality is a reflection of me, my internal vibration. And that is actually a huge shift. I think people go through life and never get that. But that is, for me, is the first step in awakening, like realizing that I am generating this reality from my thoughts, feelings, and actions, and if I change myself, then the world around me and everybody in it begins to change to match it. So that's incredibly empowering when you get that. And that, for me, is that second stage of life is happening for me. I'm the creator of my reality. And actually, even the really tough things that have happened in life have helped me get to this point, have helped me evolve. And so it takes you out of that kind of victim ego mindset. It's like the first softening, you could say, from the ego or from that head mind dominated consciousness. So just throw that in, because I could feel you going on to stage 3.
Yes, I get that. And you made a good point there. What was coming in when you were sharing that is what personal development is good at is getting you to change your language. And anybody that's done any amount of deep personal development work will know that it's affirmations, write them down, look in a mirror, repeat it, listen to it, repeating to you all the time. So what you're doing is when you're listening to this stuff, you're actually creating thoughts. Thoughts are things. So although to me, it's not how you manifest with what I've learned now, it did work. There's no doubt about it. I manifested buying that business that I bought because there was various criteria I wanted. And believe it or not, that criteria turned up in that business. And I saw that a couple of years after, because I was still using affirmations, etc., because that's what I've been taught. And you're quite right. It teaches you a language to move to the next stage.
Yes, and affirmations are great. All that world, I think, is great. The world of a manifestation, etc. But like you said earlier, it's almost a way of managing life or controlling life, it doesn't actually, like you said earlier, it's like it doesn't actually process the underlying energy or the trauma. You know, it's like a way to bypass it, like get around it, get over it. Like a negative thought comes up, oh, I'm going to switch that to a positive thought. Great if you can do that, but you haven't actually done anything about the hurt little boy or girl inside that needs your presence. And that's kind of like going on to the third stage.
And what I also want to add in there is when you manifest using that type of ego-based will to create, you lose it again.
Yeah.
Because they take it off you. Because it's well, we'll talk about that when we get into the next stage. You're quite right. So it's just hold on to the thought of why we lose it, and we'll come back to that as we go through. So
exactly that, because you haven't actually changed the foundation of who you are. Right. It's like our teachers talk about this all the time, but it's like you've got a apple tree and you're like, well, I'm fed up of seeing apples all the time. I want oranges. So you, but like personal development is like, well, I'm going to go and take all the apples off and chop the branches off, and then, oh, I should start getting oranges. But then what happens? The tree is the same, so you still got getting apples. Like you've got to go down into the foundations of the tree and into the roots and grow a totally different tree, and then you'll start getting oranges. You know,
yes.
And this is where you start talking about stage 3, which is life is happening through me. So we're very much here going from that head ego thought dominated consciousness where certainly most of the Western world is, and we're taking that journey. I mean, you could say it's quite a short physical journey, but in actuality, it's a long journey, you know, to start going from that head dominated consciousness, because it's got so much momentum, and we're constantly getting conditioning, you know, from society that's telling us the opposite. But once you get a little glimpse of who you are, like you said, the heart comes online, you start feeling, and you know, it's very much takes us onto the work we do today, which is about reconnecting with the body. And it can take a long time for people to start feeling anything in the body. It can be a lot of numbness initially.
And you know what? That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how long it takes. And I know anybody that's watching this on those words, when I say it doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter how long it takes, will trigger just about everybody. Because we're in a society where we press a button and it comes tomorrow. And we're conditioned into that. So what tends to happen, and I know because I've been there, is we get impatient for this unfolding to come. I used to pick books up and start reading them, and I didn't know what I read, but I needed to get, because the part was coming on screen. Oh, you need to read this. So it would read it, but it wouldn't absorb it. So you're quite right. It's I'm just losing. Just bear with me. Let me just feel into which way I was going there. So when we begin to touch the self, we let go of this, and that's what happened to me. Huge. I let go of it in a huge way. Not everybody lets go of it in a. So it can take quite a while. It doesn't matter how long it does take. It's all about understand. And I think we go from curiosity, stage 1, as we're going through, because something guides us through that, to where we probably start learning things and get curious. So we get a belief starts to happen, and then we might fall into a program or a guru, or we might plug into Cryon, or it doesn't matter. There are lots and lots of people out there, like you quite say. It's a very noisy space now, because the whole, and that goes to my initial view, the whole essence is that we are here to awaken, to connect with the self, and that's what the planet's doing. And as people grow and awaken, it does lots of other things, which we're not going to get involved with because it goes down a different rabbit hole. But so when that awareness begins to awaken, and we then start different healing paths. And I've spoke to you about my journey before. So I went on one path, you went on another path. Different people we know, they go down different paths. those drums behind me, the lady I work with, she's a shaman. She went through a hugely different path to me. And I actually can, with the stuff I read and what I'm learning now, I'm actually going to her with some of it to validate it, because it's pretty deep stuff. And she goes, oh yeah, that validates what I've been saying about so-and-so, so-and-so. So she joins dots up validation for herself, because she's still got to trust in what these beings are saying to her.
Right.
Okay, so
Spirit.
because
Yeah.
her human, her ego can still get in the way of it.
Yes.
And take her, to me, she's far more enlightened than I am. Her gifts, she's a facilitator of healing, and her gifts are far stronger than mine are. I have to use a drum, she doesn't. When I say I have to use a drum, let me rephrase that. I'm fortunate enough to have these drums in my hand, and I point them in the right direction and they do the stuff. She does not need a drum, she can do it without. She can just do it, and the energy will come through it, and she does it. But even then, they sometimes want to go a lot further than she does.
Right.
So she's told me she pulls back as a human, because it's like, oh, it's a bit scary going down there.
Yeah.
So, and I've seen her do some miraculous healings on people in broad daylight with people watching. It's quite amazing. But so that to me is a path where she's gone down a very different path. And the people that are watching this, some of it might sound a bit out there or whatever, but it all starts with just doing practices, and meditation is huge.
Yes.
I believe the only way we connect with self is we need to come in on meditation practice. If I'm working with clients and they're not meditating, then, and I'm not sure, because I'm still learning, if these drums are working on people that aren't meditating, I'm not sure how that works with them, because these drums will find parts and they'll push the part out, or they'll draw it out. So those woundings we're talking about, that's what they do. And I'm very, very much in the very early stages of learning all this, by the way. So I don't know fully what they'll do or what they're capable of, but what I have seen so far is amazing. But it's an energy that comes through, and it starts to me with meditation. So daily practices of meditation, and then when we meditate, this is where I'm going now to the next stage that you're talking about. When we begin, from my perception anyway, when we meditate, we begin to connect more with the self, and the intuition then comes online. When intuition comes online, like when I first met the brothers we work with, I thought they were a pair of prats. I was watching them and thinking, who are these prats? And I turned them off. The mind.
Well, these are our teachers, by the way. For anyone who doesn't know, these are the guys who introduced us to this particular energy healing work.
And so, and then I don't know how long it was later, a period of time went by, and then I'd started meditating, connecting, working out, and they said something. I just thought, I wonder what they're on about today. And I watched it, and I'm like, oh yeah, it landed, because I was ready. As Buddha says, when the student's ready, the teacher's ready.
Yeah.
So we're all on our different journeys. We're all on our different experiences. And my intuition immediately then was, you need more of this.
Yeah.
And then I had a bit of a healing with somebody outside of that space, local to here. And that was like, wow, I need more of this. So, and then I need more of this, and I need more of this. And this is where I'm pointing to when I said earlier, patience and grace, because I need more of it is probably a really good intention. But we need to go at a pace where the wounding can dissipate. And that leads me up to the manifestation. In my actual view, when we're clearing woundings and healings and distortions and conditions and those parts that you talked about at the beginning, those emotions we feel, when we learn how to release those, we learn to receive something else.
Next
And
space.
you can name it what you want. You can name it source energy, you can name it unconditional love, you can name it spirit, you can, whatever label you want to give it, it doesn't matter. All I know is we begin to receive something else, and then all of a sudden things start happening, like magic things, like white rabbits out of hats. And I could sit here and list them, and so could you, and people just have to take your word for those experiences. And even if you explain the synchronicities and what you've experienced, if people are turning away from it, they'll still not accept it. So to me, that's what it's about. And it's an evolving journey.
Yeah, it never ends.
Correct.
What I wanted to add there, I think I love what you said about meditation. Like, now there are infinite amount of paths that you can take on this journey of awakening, but you know, for me, my one non-negotiable, what is it? I've said there's more than one, but I mean that 30 minutes when I get up in the morning, yoga, gratitude, meditation. That's what I do, and this is my kind of self-to-self work, as we talk about on this path. It's vital. You know, I just sit with myself, listen to the thoughts, feel into the energy and the emotion. Sometimes it's blissful, sometimes it's quite uncomfortable, but you know, just being able to sit with yourself and not turn away and not distract yourself, huge. And obviously what's happening there in the second stage is you are becoming aware of the thought process. You're listening to the thought process instead of, like most people in the world, are just lost in the thought process, being led around by their mind, their trauma and their conditioning. In that second stage, you're starting to become aware of, I'm not my thoughts. I thought I was the voice in the head, but if I can listen to the voice in the head, who am I? Now, when I first started realizing that on a meditation retreat, that sent me for a loop. That did, because I could hear the mind going, if I'm not the thoughts, who am I? And that's where you talk about you've got to go a steady pace. Like I never recommend people, like, you got to be careful with things like plant medicine as well. You don't want it too often. It can like accelerate the process, raise your vibration, and it kind of everything speeds up. And as well with like long meditation retreats, you got to be careful with that as well, because you raise your awareness very quickly, and the mind, the ego, can't quite keep up with the pace of these things. You know, so you got to go at your own pace. But it took me a while to kind of like, as the soul, the spirit, the self started to wake up, you could say, in that sense. Ram Dass talks about this. It was quite shaky initially, and the mind got a bit lost and confused, and the self was only just coming online. So you got to be careful in that first stage of awakening. You know, as you start to not sure who you truly are, and it slowly starts to become clearer. But if you're consistent with that meditative practice, whatever you can do, I would do at least half an hour, but if you can do 10 minutes, 15 minutes is great. You can kind of slowly, you know, increase that awareness as you go. And so it doesn't become too overwhelming for the ego. And you've got to maintain that practice. You've got to be dedicated. That's one of the things I always say about awakening. You've got to be dedicated. It's got to come from you, really, because if you stop doing the work, you're going to go back to sleep again, you know, or to an extent. You know, you've really got to maintain it, because those parts sneak up on you very quickly, and you can lose your alignment with self again. So you've got to maintain that meditative practice. But the one thing I was going to add, the one thing that kind of accelerated me beyond stage 2 and into stage 3, which is like life is happening through me, which is basically like stepping out of the way completely, as you said, with your teacher now. She kind of, the mind, the ego is kind of always trying to step in and question what's happening, what the people, the gut spirits are saying. Same when I'm sat with people, it's like sometimes I get some intuition to say something. Sometimes I feel something and the mind will come in. Oh, that could be yours, or it could be theirs, or, you know, the mind is always trying to get involved and, you know, kind of pull you back a bit. This third stage really is about the mind kind of stepping out of the way. Now, we're not trying to destroy the ego, which is kind of what you hear quite often on the spiritual path early on. Is like, the aim is to destroy the ego, is to completely quieten the mind and shut it up. which is more ego, really. That's not really what this is about. It's about listening to the mind, realizing it has its place. What I always say is it's about having the mind or the ego in the passenger seat and not the driver's seat. So you can kind of listen, the self is in the driver's seat. You can kind of listen to the ego chirping up and doing its thing, but you're not being driven by it anymore. You're just kind of like, oh, it has its place. It's there to keep me alive. It's there to keep me safe. It's beautiful. It's kept me alive to this point. It's done its job, but now's the time to step aside and for the true self to come through. And the true self really is, you can put whatever name you want to it, but this loving awareness that is connected to source, and the realization that there's actually a much greater intelligence out there than just the human mind, which I think is where most human beings think that we're the height of intelligence, human beings. But you start to realize that, oh, actually, the human mind is very, very limited. And there's a whole ocean of intelligence out there available to us if we're willing to surrender the mind, bring the body to rest, and open up to it. And as you said, you kind of trust that intelligence more and more. It brings things into your life. You receive intuitions, you receive downloads. And the more you surrender, the more you go with the flow of life, the easier it becomes, and the more aligned it becomes, and better it becomes, essentially. And it's because it's only when we get lost in the trauma and the parts that life starts to become difficult, and we lose that alignment. So it's a very much a process of learning to surrender to the flow of the stream and not trying to constantly fight against it and grab the side. Learning to let go. It's terrifying to the ego, but learning to just go with the current. And just trusting that this great intelligence knows what's best for you, which is how I kind of explain that third stage, which is life is happening through me, just getting out of the way and surrendering to the flow of life. But one final thing I want to say is that what really helped me in this stage is going from meditating on my own each day to meditating in community.
Yes.
One-on-one, connecting one-on-one with others, or in groups, as I do every day now in my community, in the community. This helps you to come. I think the tendency is on the spiritual part to think that you have to do it on your own, meditate on your own. You're in a cave on your own in the Himalayas or something like that. But we're human beings. We're designed for connection. We're much better. Our well-being is, much better when we're in communities and groups, tribes, and our spiritual evolution and our awakening journey is accelerated when we start connecting it to others and opening up our systems to receive support. So that's an essential part of this third stage, or it was for me anyway. But would you say the same, Stephen?
Yes, yeah, I would absolutely. There's not much more to add to that. But what I do want to do, what's coming, is I want to leave you with a mind teaser, really. And I connected these dots just recently because essentially what I do is I work with these drums and they create a sound, a frequency. Sound is a wave, it's a frequency. If you look into teachings, at the moment our bodies vibrate at a level, and that gives us matter, solid. Okay. As we move through, and my understanding is as we move through dimensions, some people call it ascending, use that word if you want, but take, for instance, Jesus as a master is an energy, is a frequency, either of light or sound. So the question is, as we're growing, do we raise our frequency and lower our vibration?
Interesting.
And I'll leave that with you to give that.
Oh, there you go. On that bombshell.
Huge. That's a pretty huge, different way.
I was going to say, like in the chat, people, anyone who's kind of like got any thoughts on that one? I'd never heard that before. Interesting one. But the idea that Buddha and Jesus or Muhammad or whatever it might be, it's a channel that anyone can connect to, isn't it? It's not like a physical person. You can tune into it.
Yeah, well, your higher self, if you think about it, you call spirit. So spirit's an energy, and we're all energy. Everything's energy. And energy either vibrates to create solid form, but then all of a sudden it turns from solid into gas, doesn't it?
Yes.
If you boil water, it turns from solid into a gas. So your form that we're in, because sound, what I've learned is it, and sound bath healing, drumming, anything like that heals. There's no two ways about it. People can use their hands the same as my spiritual mentor uses her hands. That's what I'm meaning. She can detect things in people's bodies with her hands. She's doing it with a frequency, a wave of energy. So that's the big question. If we lower our vibration but look to raise our frequency as we're on our spiritual journey, we're raising our frequency for different dimensions, because to move from one dimension to another, my understanding and my learning is you need to be at a different frequency. That's why you hear light language. When people do light language, a lot of them will sing. Why do they sing? Because it's at a frequency. Why is music so popular? Because it's at a frequency. So we all respond, in my view and my learning, to frequency. Leave that one with you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Stephen, mate. I'll let you go. I know it's your family time now. Yeah. Thank you, brother.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for sharing, bro.
As always,
I'll close up here.